The N5005 is the new flagship IEM from AKG announced in CES 2018. It replaces the highly regarded K3003 released 7 years ago in 2011. When AKG designed this earphone, they based off the sound signature around the newly developed Harman Target Curve for earphones, which in itself is basically an attempt at an average of sound signatures the general public likes when it comes to IEMs. Similar to the K3003, this earphone is also based on hybrid configuration, but there are a few notable upgrades, including the use of 2 extra balanced armature drivers in both earpieces, 1 extra set of acoustic filters that allow for sound tweaking according to the user's preferences, as well as a few accessories that greatly expands the usability and flexibility of this earphone. With an MSRP of $1,000, how good is the N5005? In this video, we'll examine every aspect of this earphone as a whole package, from the accessories, physical design of the earphone, sound quality to ear tip compatibility, in order to determine whether this earphone is worth the high price tag. This is Earphoneus Fanaticus, and here I present you my in-depth review of the AKG N5005. Now, if you've watched any of my other reviews before, you will know that I always start from the product packaging of the earphone and let you know what it's like to unbox it. But since I always have the actual unboxing and first look uploaded before my reviews, I feel like it will be unnecessary to repeat the unboxing experience. So if you are interested in the unboxing, I'll have a link in the video description down below. That being said, I would still like to talk about a few items on the box to serve as an introduction to the earphone. To start off, the N5005 is a reference class, 5-driver, 4-way crossover earphone. A 9.2mm dynamic driver is responsible for the sub-bass, 1 BA driver as a woofer, 1 BA driver for the mids, and finally 2 BA drivers for the higher frequencies. All the BA drivers used here are made by the renowned company Nose Corporation. The reason why they chose this configuration is because that's what it took for AKG to reach the Harman sound signature that AKG aimed for, which I'll talk about when we get to the sound quality evaluation. Frequency response ranges from a very low 10Hz to 40 kHz, which means the N5005 is a high-res audio certified earphone. While it is impossible for us to determine how good the sound signature is when it comes to anything above 20 kHz, we can instead examine whether it actually reaches 10Hz. Now, I'm not saying AKG can't be trusted, but it's just that every manufacturer uses a different definition when it comes to quoting the frequency response, so we can't just directly compare the reported numbers between different earphones. The impedance on the N5005 is a relatively forgiving, yet still demanding 18 ohms. So as long as your audio source has an output impedance of around 1 to 2 ohms, you should be fine. Anything above 2 ohms would likely result in a few decibels of difference in certain frequencies due to the mismatch of impedance between the source and the earphone, meaning the sound signature can differ drastically depending on the quality of your source. Sensitivity is rated at a relatively high 116 decibels, so getting a loud enough volume out of this earphone shouldn't be too difficult. But since it is not as high as something like the K3003 at 125 decibels, you can expect less hissing noises being reported by the earphone due to poor source design against interference. Here's a quick comparison between the N5005 and the original K3003. To summarize, because the N5005's impedance is higher, while sensitivity is lower than the K3003, the N5005 is actually a little bit less picky when it comes to the output source. Many people have reported that the K3003 requires very good source to be driven properly, so in this regard I think the N5005 makes a small improvement here by allowing more sources to be compatible with it. Frequency response on the N5005 extends way more than the K3003, but who cares about that anyway? Let's check out the star of the show, the AKG N5005. It follows the traditional IEM form factor used by the likes of Shure, Westone, Newforce, etc. The housing is made of a matte black plastic and ceramic in a piano black colorway. Underneath the ceramic part, we can see a tiny exhaust hole, possibly for the dynamic driver that sits directly above it. On the medial side, the left-right indication can be found, as well as the model number 5005. If we remove the ear tip, we can actually see the acoustic filter. There are 4 filters available for the N5005, including bass boost, reference, mid-high boost as well as high boost. Mid-high boost is a new addition compared to the previous flagship K3003. The way these filters work is that there are holes with special patterns built within the filter that dampen certain frequencies. So for example, bass boost is done by dampening the treble, while high boost means no dampening at all. By default, the reference sound filters are fitted onto the earphone. To change filters, we just need to unscrew the original filter from the sound tube and screw on the new ones. I'll talk about how they each change the sound signature later on when it evaluates the overall sound quality of this earphone. The casing seems to be relatively small, and yet AKG is still able to fit 5 drivers on both sides. The way they did it is by putting the 2 BA responsible for treble inside the sound tube, followed by the mids and woofer that sits parallel to the casing, and finally the 9.2mm dynamic driver behind. This is different from the K3003, which has all 3 drivers firing directly into our ear canal in a straight line. This earphone is very comfortable to use. If you've worn Shure's earphones before, you will know exactly what I'm talking about. Unfortunately, noise isolation is just average on these. Overall, I think the N5005 is a very good looking yet subtle earphone. It's not gonna be as attention grabbing like those ridiculous JH or AAW earphones. Chances are, if another audiophile passes by, they wouldn't even notice you're wearing a pair of expensive IEM. Next, let's check out the included accessories. I have a feeling we're going to have to spend a lot of time here because AKG actually packed a lot of goodies this time around. Let's start with the most special one out of the bunch, an aptX-compatible Bluetooth cable. The official model of this is the AKG N5005BC. You can convert any of your IEM with MMCX sockets to a wireless earphone. It only takes 15 minutes to charge up, and it can play for 8 hours after one full charge. The cable is rounded near the earpiece and flat near the neck region, which can help reduce tangling. There's also a choker that allows you to cinch the cable a bit if you find it too long. There aren't a lot of buttons here. We have a play-pause button that can also act as the power button for the Bluetooth chips in the cable, as well as a volume up and down button. I haven't tried this on Apple devices simply because I don't have any at the moment, but I did try them with my OnCue DP-X1A and the buttons all work fine. I don't want to speak too much more about this cable because I plan on making a separate video to explore how good it is compared to physical connections. But to simply put, I think this Bluetooth cable is actually really convenient and it sounds great. It is also compatible with other MMCX earphones, not just the N5005, but too bad you can't buy it as a standalone product. My only concern I have is that I find it very hard to believe someone who buys an expensive earphone like this will actually choose wireless over physical connection. Audiophiles always want the purest signal as possible, and using something wireless is definitely a big taboo to them. And even though we can always switch in and out the Bluetooth cable whenever we need wireless, say before we go to work, but what will we do when we get back home? Change out the cable again and repeat the cycle the next day? I'm pretty sure the MMCX sockets would cry in agony if we keep up the torture. But I do think it makes a lot of sense to pair it with your spare earphones that you don't use anymore, so that you will have a wired, super high quality earphone and a beta wireless earphone. But coming back to the other accessories, there's a USB cable for charging the Bluetooth cable, as well as one non-braided 3.5mm cable, one braided 3.5mm cable with MIDI control, and a braided 2.5mm balance cable, of course all using MMCX. So yeah, there are 4 ways you can connect the N5005 to most audio sources out there. Absolute bonkers. I especially welcome the inclusion of the balance cable because my DP-X1A, along with many DAPs on the market for the past few years, supports balance output. Let's check out some of these cables. This one is the only non-braided one. Now looking at the MMCX connector, I already see a flaw in that there are no ear guides. This is bad because it will flip-flop more and fall from your ears. Another flaw is that there is no choker above the Y split, so we can't tidy up the cable first before packing it away, and then tangling the whole damn thing is very annoying. Besides, the cable terminates with a straight angle jack which breaks more often for me than right angle ones. Overall, the build quality is quite nice and looks good because of the use of the metal bits that are in a sort of gunmetal color, but the omission of ear guides and choker is really puzzling. Now something interesting about this cable is that during unboxing, I found this cable literally just sitting on top of the actual earphone box, while the rest of the cables are inside the box. Not really sure what's going on there. The next ones are the braided 3.5mm and 2.5mm cable. They look very different from the previous ones because it's got a bronze copper theme going on. These two cables feature the same physical design and they both use molded ear guides. Personally, I think this is better than the previous cable, but still not ideal because I prefer metal wired ear guides more. The cables are 8 braided, and together with the weight of the materials used, they are very flexible and are less prone to cable noise. On the 3.5mm cable, there's a media control, including once again play, pause, volume up and down buttons. Behind these we can actually see a tiny little switch that allows you to flip between iOS and Android devices. Very cool touch, I like it. Interestingly, this cable also has a choker, but the media controls would just get in the way so we can't cinch up both sides of the cable too much. Finally, it terminates with a straight angled jack, which is the same on the balance cable. It is super tiny and I'm always afraid of applying too much torsion and bending here, but so far neither of the cables have broken, so I guess it works well enough. Overall, I definitely prefer the design of this cable more than the previous one. There's still some other goodies including this little flight adapter, a cleaning tool, a place that holds 3 sets of sound filters that we talked about before, 4 pairs of black silicone tips from XS to L, as well as 3 pairs of specially designed SpinFit CP145 ear tips in small, medium and large. They might look very similar to the super popular CP100, but as you can see here, the CP145 of medium size features a longer flange than the same sized CP100. The core is thinner, but slightly wider to accommodate the M5005 sound tube, and upon closer inspection, you can see the ring around the flange on the CP100 is actually absent on the CP145. The rest of the accessories include this curious little piece of foam with a ceramic plate stuck on top that has the serial number etched on, and finally a pill-shaped carrying case that also has the serial number. I'm pretty sure this case is water resistant because the zips are covered by some rubber that provides an extremely tight seal, but it also makes unzipping the case a bit of a chore. But once you do open it up, you are greeted with 2 netted compartments for maybe storing some silica gels and some extra ear tips, and you're supposed to sandwich your earphone in between when the case closes up. So far, I have to say I'm extremely impressed by the completeness of the whole package. Not only do we get the usual stock ear tips, flight adapter and carrying case, we also get some special SpinFits and 4 cables, including a balance cable and a Bluetooth cable nonetheless, and whatever this is. Of course, not all of them is perfect, but at least I don't feel like I'm being ripped off by the high asking price of $999 US. Not to mention I didn't even have to pay the full price because I bought mine from Yodobashi with a Union Pay discount, so I only paid around $840 US. The only brand I know that can somewhat match this level of generosity is Danu, but even then, I only got 2 cables when I unboxed their DK3001, and actually one of them even came broken. What the fuck, man? Now of course it's not just about how many accessories they packed. What truly justifies the asking price will be the performance of the IEM itself. And keeping in mind that this earphone was designed to match, or at least mimic, Harman's Target Curve for IEM, with AKG being owned by Harman of course, this earphone should have pretty much the most ideal sound signature that would be preferred by many people. So is the M5005 a textbook example of what everybody should like, or the so-called targets that all IEMs should strive for? In the following section, I'll analyze the sound signature and the technical capabilities of this earphone. These impressions are done with my on-cue DPX1A as my audio source with ACG mode turned off, log range adjust at +2, and digital filter set to sharp. In the past, this section was always done with my older DPX1, and even though I did use the same settings as before, the results could be very slightly different considering the DPX1A is indeed better sounding. The earphone itself is fitted with the reference sound filter and the SpinFit CP145 in large that came with this earphone. Since the M5005 comes with a 2.5mm cable, I'll be presenting all my impressions from using balanced output from my DAP for the most optimal performance. Let's start from the base. IEM manufacturers often use different kinds of tuning here. Some would go for a measurably flat response in order to create a reference sound. Some would do a mid-bass hum to create a warm and body bass that isn't that punchy. Some would even do a flat response with a roll-off in the sub-bass. And since AKG marketed this earphone as a reference sound IEM, you might be inclined to think flat response is what they went with here. But I can tell you, the bass is nowhere near flat at all. Instead, what they opted for is a stronger presence in the sub-bass region that gradually declines as we move on to the mid-bass. The result of such tuning is a very punchy, intense, and meaty bass that extends to the lowest frequency the earphone is capable of, but it is so well finessed that it never sounds overpowering at all. Because of this, the bass never takes the center stage, but rather it embellishes the music with deep rumbling excitement. By ears, I can say that the advertised 10Hz is easily reachable, but it is not as strong as 20Hz, but this is possibly because I'm just more sensitive to 20Hz than 10Hz. But what's even more impressive is that there is no rattling at all when doing sweeps in the lower frequencies, which is an indicator of the bass unit's high quality. Overall, I would say that this is pretty much the ideal bass response for me. Now of course, this is not the reference bass the die-hard audiophiles wished for, and they have all the reasons to hate the N5005 because of this. But I think the kind of reference AKG talked about is a bass signature that most music lovers like, a representative of the preferences of the general masses, not what professionals working in studios rely on. And for this, the N5005 gets a 100% approval from me in terms of bass response. And even if you don't like this amount of sub-bass, you still have to admit that the added volume does mean you are more likely to be able to hear the bass when you're out on the street. So, the bass is practically perfect for me. But what about the mids? This is the range where most important musical elements fall in, including the melody, musical instruments, and of course male and female vocals. If an earphone doesn't perform here, it might as well be never made. Thankfully, I also think the mids are fantastic as well. Vocals are always clean and clear without a hint of sibilance or graininess, but it's also not so distant that they're drowned out when playing through some busy passages in the music. This indicates to me that the 1 to 2 kHz region is tuned just right, meaning it is not nasally or muffled, nor does it stand out excessively. But there's one caveat to the tuning here in that because the previously mentioned increase in bass tuning actually gradually declines from 20Hz to maybe around 200Hz, the lower mids become less of a focus than something like the K3003 or the WDK3001. This means when you listen to things like cello music, they don't reverberate as much, and instead there's a greater emphasis on the actual bowing texture. This also means male vocal is not as masculine. However, this kind of tuning does have the benefits of making the overall presentation a bit more open and not as suffocating as the previously mentioned DK3001. So overall, while personally I do like the tuning AKG did here, a lot of this comes down to what you want from the music. Do you want the mids more reverberant and masculine, or do you want it to be more articulate? Personally, I think either one is good, so once again the N5005 gets high marks from me in terms of mid-frequency response. Now if you've watched any of my other reviews before, you will know that I'm usually quite lenient when it comes to bass and mid response, and generally I won't hate the earphone too much if it got a little bit of those ranges wrong. But the one thing I care about a lot is how the treble is tuned. There are a lot of otherwise great sounding earphones, some of them top of the line even, that are completely ruined for me simply because the treble is slightly less to my liking. So how about the N5005? As a treble head, I'm happy to report that this earphone is fantastic here as well. Let's begin with the usual frequency analysis. By ears, I think it starts low from 8 kHz and transitions to an extremely sharp peak at 11 kHz, but then it dips quite a bit afterwards to around 16 kHz, then gradually drops in volume to around 18 kHz. The earphone remains faintly audible even up to 20 kHz, which is something I've never experienced on other earphones. My analysis actually seems to be quite consistent with this graph here published by Harman, though the sharp peak I mentioned should be at around 9 to 10 kHz instead. This is not very surprising, because usually measurements taken beyond 10 kHz are not very accurate, and there's a certain resonance specific to each measurement system, in this case probably at around 9 to 10 kHz. This is also why the curves for the N5005 seems to be so far off from the Harman Target Curve for IEM I mentioned earlier, represented by the red curve here. But without going into any more details that I'm not qualified to comment on, I think the moral of the story here is that we can't just look at the curves and think AKG messed up, and instead we should believe in what our ears perceive when it comes to the treble. And to me, I think the N5005 opts to have more lower treble presence than something like a favorite of mine, the On-Cue E900M. Therefore, the treble might not sound as thin, airy, or clean as a result. But what it means is that it might actually reflect things like cymbals a little bit more realistically. Now, despite the stronger lower treble presence, I still don't think it is that prominent outside of listening to frequency sweeps, and I'm happy to report there is no sibilance, which is something earphones with strong high treble presence are more prone to. Overall, I have nothing to complain about in regards to the treble, and with this I can comfortably say this earphone carries one of the nicest sound signatures I've ever heard in an earphone, and it does look like all the science AKG did when developing this earphone were not in vain after all. Of course, talking about the sound signature of this earphone could prove to be slightly tricky, because if you use a different filter, it will be different. So here's a brief rundown of how I feel about the other filters. Starting with the bass boost, I think it works quite well because it is indeed able to boost the bass by lowering the treble, resulting in a more relaxing listen. But problems come whenever I try band sounds or anything with lots of cymbals. In particular, I find the filter taking out so much sparkle in the treble that the music becomes somewhat hollow and boring. So I can only recommend this filter if you don't listen to anything that has anything to do with band sounds, or if you really find the treble unbearable out of the box. Moving on to the mid-high boost filter, I find it to be largely the same as the reference filter, except vocals stands out slightly more, and yet there's still no sibilance most of the time. And referring back to the frequency response curves I showed you earlier, using this filter might even allow the earphone to match the target curve more, considering there is a dip in the 2K to 4K region, but I don't know exactly what range the filter increases, so it's all just my little speculation. However, I do think vocals could be shouty at times, so it kind of depends on the mastering of the soundtrack. Finally, we have the high boost filter. This is basically the same as the mid-high boost, except there is even more vocal presence, and at this point, breathing noises become very obvious, so overall it sounds quite unnatural. I would suggest avoiding this filter altogether. Another important aspect to how the earphone sounds besides sound signature is the soundstage. The very best earphones should have both wide, horizontal and tall vertical soundstage, but most of the really good ones only excel in one of these. Let's first talk about the horizontal soundstage on the N5005. I would say it is wide and airy, and coupled with this amazing ability to layer, separate and position sounds, if you only want to focus on one single element in, say, a piece of orchestral or band music, you absolutely can. I would say the N5005 is easily the best performer I have in my collection in this regard, and I think this probably also makes it a great choice for gaming, though I suppose most of you who game will stick with gaming headsets. Now, even though the N5005 performs with flying colors when it comes to horizontals, I have to say there's practically no vertical layering to speak of, so the vertical soundstage is short, and you can't really get that sort of wall of sound effect. If I can use a shape to describe the overall soundstage, I would say it's basically like a really long rectangle. Not perfect, but already a huge upgrade compared to the original K3003, which was basically like a small square. Where the K3003 does perform better though, is the shaping and texturing of the individual elements. I think it is just a bit more articulate than the N5005. Small yet noticeable difference. Now let's briefly touch on dynamic range. This refers to the range of volume the earphone can play. Larger range means you don't need to turn up the volume just to hear the softer elements, all the while risking hearing damage from the very loud elements that are also present in the same soundtrack. Unfortunately, the N5005 seems to be quite average here, reaching only -66 decibels by ears in a quiet room. The best performer in my collection, the Sony MDR EX1000, reaches -78 decibels max. Keep in mind, these results are done by my own ears only and will be different depending on the surrounding environment, so just take this as a grain of salt. Finally, I want to dedicate a section on ear-tip matching, because chances are, if you are an earphone collector watching this video, you should also have a collection of third-party ear tips. I have in my collection the SpinFit CP100, the double-flange SpinFit CP220 and CP230, Comply, JVC Spiral Dots, and Sony Hybrids. But the CP100s and Sony Hybrids are both too narrow to be put onto the N5005, so I'll only be comparing the remaining ones with the CP145 that came with the earphone. I didn't include the black tips in this comparison because technically the CP145 is also part of the stock ear tips, and I just find it to fit better than the black ones anyway, not to mention the black tips make the bass a bit boomy and overwhelming. So let's begin with the double-flange SpinFit, the CP220 and the wider CP230. From a previous review I made last year regarding the double-flange SpinFits, I found them to be quite uncomfortable, and getting a good seal really depends on the shape of the earphone. And unfortunately, the same can be said when I use them with the N5005. No matter how hard I tried jamming the earphone into my ears, I just couldn't get them to seal. And as a result, the bass takes a huge hit to the point where the low frequencies are basically completely gone. So I guess if you really hate the bass on the N5005, you might want to give these a shot, but I highly doubt any sensible human being would do it. Next is the Comply Memoryphone ear tips. Because of the Comply's relatively big form factor and the long sound chip of the N5005, when these ear tips are used, it becomes slightly irritating to my ear canal, but it's not a huge problem. In terms of sound quality, I think it makes the N5005 slightly raw sounding, and musical elements tend to be very slightly less defined. But this could be a good thing because it means the earphone also might be more relaxed sounding to the ears. Against the CP145, I really see no reason for the Comply to be considered with this earphone. It's not that it really makes the earphone that much worse. I mean, I do think it suits those who might find the N5005's U-shaped signature to be too rock sounding. But personally, I think the strength in the N5005 really lies in how it is able to wow you with the exciting sound signature, and the CP145 already accentuates this perfectly. Not to mention it comes with the earphone already, and with it being a silicone tip unlike the Comply, it will for sure outlast multiple pairs of Comply before it is even marginally worn down, if at all. The final ear tip to check out is the JVC Spiral Dot. Because of the long sound chute of the N5005, this ear tip doesn't actually fit the earphone, and instead it just kind of sits at the terminal end held by some notches. But despite the weird fit, I think the Spiral Dot could be good depending on the genre. There is less soft bass, so the earphone becomes less exciting, but the vertical soundstage does receive a slight boost, making it more open sounding. And together with the earphone's amazing horizontal imaging, this combination is quite good for orchestral music, though if you enjoy pop music more, you should still stick with the CP145. And personally, this is what I've been doing for the most part after getting the earphone. The AKG N5005 is built with the intention to favor as many music lovers as possible by basing its sound signature on the average preferences of the general public. And while AKG is marketing it as a reference earphone, its sound signature certainly follows anything but the traditional reference sound. And with the old yet still famous previous flagship, the K3003 lurking in its shadow, is the N5005 a worthwhile successor that is good enough to bear the torch? Is this something you can comfortably sink $1,000 in? Or I guess a more interesting question to think about would be, is this earphone an endgame gear? Something that sounds so good that you can use for many years to come without needing to upgrade? In many ways, I think this earphone is an absolutely amazing product. Not only is the sound signature practically perfect to my ears, the traditional IEM form factor makes it so easy to put them into my ears and enjoy some of the best listening experience I can get from an IEM without having to fiddle with fitting whatsoever. It doesn't look as fancy as most of the top-of-the-line earphones out there, but its black ceramic and matte black casing makes it something you can admire without getting tired of, and you don't have to worry about it being too gaudy to use on the street. Not only is the earphone itself well designed both sonically and physically, the huge number of accessories that comes with it also greatly increases the value of the whole package. Kudos to AKG for working with SpinFit to design a new set of eartips for the N5005. It works so well with the N5005 that there really isn't much reason to audition any other third-party eartips. The inclusion of Bluetooth and balanced cables is worthy of high praise as well. Operation-wise, I don't see any problem with the Bluetooth cable, and because it uses MMCX, you can transform any earphone with the same connection to a set of wireless earphones as well, all the while maintaining a relatively respectable level of performance. And while the physical design of the balanced cable leaves somewhat to be desired, just the fact that I can go balanced without buying an extra set of cable already makes it a win for me. The swappable sound filters are just as cool. If you want more bass, just switch to the bass filter. If you want more vocal presence, use the mid-high filter. Now what if you want to absolutely destroy your ears? Even the high boost filter has you covered on that front. Now you might be thinking, oh, you're just fanboying over AKG now, and you know what? You're probably right. I think AKG got so many things right this time around that for once on this channel, I can finally confidently recommend a product without any major drawbacks. Not something easy to achieve, considering if you have seen any of my other videos before, you would know how picky I am. The only two problems I see that prevent this earphone from being truly an endgame piece though is that, firstly, vertical layering is practically non-existent on this, and the dynamic range is not as wide as something cheaper than it, like the EX1000 or the DK3001 by Danu. But realistically, most people don't seem to know vertical layering exists, and the dynamic range I spoke of is largely limited by the listening environment. If you're on a train, for example, you're never going to hear the soft sound in the music anyway, no matter how good the dynamic range is. Another slight concern is the fact that this earphone is something you can just buy off the shelf, also takes away some of the exclusivity that normally comes with using a pair of custom IEM, which you can certainly afford with the same price tag, but this one is probably up to personal preferences anyway. And as a final verdict, I can say without a shadow of a doubt that this earphone is worthy of its price tag, and it comes highly recommended from me. But I'm also interested in what you guys think. If you own it or have tried it before, leave your thoughts in the comment section below. If you have any other questions regarding this earphone, of course you can leave that in the comments too. Don't forget to drop a like and subscribe for more earphone reviews and unboxing in the future. This is Earphoneus Fanaticus, and I'll see you in the next video.